I'm a body psychotherapist, so I'm interested in listening to the body as well as the mind, helping them connect up. This is a talk about Frank Lake, who I first heard about a few years ago now. Doesn't seem to be particularly well known these days, but he did some intriguing work. I first heard of him about birth, but he did some intriguing work with LSD, when LSD was still legal in the 50s. And his kind of books contain some kind of extended accounts from his people he was working with about their experiences during these sessions, which I thought were really interesting, and that this conference would be a good place to talk about them. So I'll start off with a few quotes. I'm sort of shut in, but not suffocated, not yet, that came later. I'm like a pea being pushed along a pea shooter. I had a sort of roof over me like a piece of uncooked tripe with holes in it, steamy and moving by. I'm going head first with my head in a funny position, my head splashed right over to the left. I'm sort of half strangled by something around my neck. My body takes up these positions without my doing anything about it. So yeah, these are kind of direct quotes from people on LSD in a psychotherapeutic setting in the 50s and 60s. Frank Lake believed that these people were re-experiencing their own births, and so did they. And this talk is going to be about Lake, how LSD came into the picture, a bit more about how and why he used it, what he found, and what he thought about the lasting effects of birth could be. So a little bit about Frank Lake. He was born in 1914 in Lancashire. He trained in medicine, and then he went to work in India. It's important to say, actually, his parents were committed Christians. He took on their faith. He went to India, like working in a medical capacity, but with a Christian missionary organisation. And he retrained as a psychiatrist in Lincoln in Yorkshire in 1951, started doing that. And he actually began using LSD with patients in 1954, so not long after he started this new training, after a colleague recommended it might be useful in their work with people with alcoholism. So I won't go too far into LSD. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it over the weekend, but this was the mid-50s. It was legal. The company Sandoz had branded it as Delicid, and was sending it out as an experimental research drug to institutes, medical professionals. And we can get an indication of why Lake and his colleagues, apart from the recommendation, were using it from this, some of this info from the Delicid leaflet, talking about how it can be used in analytical psychotherapy to elicit release of repressed material. So basically, repression's kind of in the common language these days, but it's about keeping certain thoughts or feelings out of conscious awareness. They're hidden, but they may still exert an influence on us. And one of the kind of current theories at the time that Lake and his colleagues were working around was attachment theory. It was quite new at the time, and that's still very present now and been backed up with a lot of research. But it's basically around how the very early relationship between the infant and its primary caregiver can affect its later life in terms of the attunement between, say, the mother and the baby, and periods of separation. So this was something that him and his colleagues were interested in investigating using LSD, as somebody like Bowlby at the time was kind of observing children's behaviour. But there was this idea that could LSD be sort of used as a kind of time travel thing where you're going back to these early experiences? Can we see what the basis of these theories are, and hopefully it'll be a useful thing for the patient, as they were called then, at the same time. So, and Lake himself describes LSD as an abreactive agent, so something that aids the patient in becoming conscious of and able to express repressed traumatic experiences and memories, hopefully freeing that energy up and lessening their impact on the individual. So here's a quote from this sort of work that he was doing. So this is a patient on LSD in a session. They're saying, "I can see mother looming up in front of me. I'm recoiling from her like a wall closing in." He asks, "What is she going to do?" They say, "Smother me, destroy me, engulf me in herself." It's a hideousness and terror that comes down upon me. So it's, yeah, pretty intense stuff. And this is, it shows an example of how Lake was working. So it's in a therapeutic setting, he's talking, he's also allowing silence when they were going kind of beyond or perhaps before language if they were kind of regressing early on. And also they're able to move around. I think they're on couches, they're able to scream, make noise, kind of writhe. So there's a kind of freedom there in the therapeutic setting for them to kind of express what's going on. So how did birth come into it? Well, inconveniently for Lake, he was trying to kind of look at this stuff in the first year of life, see what's going on there, but it seemed to keep coming up that patients were reporting that they were experiencing their births. It seemed to be, yeah, that this was inconvenient because he, as he says later, as a new psychiatrist, he wanted to be aligned with the current theories, and also there was the opinion that there's no way this could be possible because the neonate, the newborn, it can't remember sensation, it doesn't have a kind of memory aspect as well. But so he tried to resist that for the first 3 years of his research, 55 to 58. He kind of thought it was more of a symbolic thing, even though his patients were kind of insisting that, no, this seems really real. But as it says here, a number of cases occurred that seemed so kind of uncannily convincing that his suspicion was shaken. So there's kind of evidence of people experiencing, say, forceps delivery, this coming up in the sessions, or something, the cord being wrapped around their neck, and that this bit later was confirmed with members of the family. He also talks about how medical professionals in the hospital he was working in were kind of really taken by this as well. They were kind of, well, this seems so vivid, so realistic, so real, that there must be something to it. So, yeah, in 1966 he's saying that these things are so, I have no remaining doubts. And he also notes that other psychiatrists who were using LSD at the time, this was coming up for them too, so it wasn't just him. Notably Stanislav Grof, Czech psychiatrist, who's much better known than Lake these days, and who went on to develop his own theories around birth and its impacts on the individual that Lake later kind of agreed with, added some stuff to from his perspective. So Lake wasn't alone in witnessing this, and it's important to note, I think also he wasn't deliberately trying to bring about birth experiences, but maybe it was something to do with the therapeutic setting, which was about going back in time, trying to find this early stuff, and it kept going back in time. So who was he working with, and how was he working? So in his earlier days, he was working in a psychiatric hospital in Yorkshire. In the late 50s, he started pioneering something called clinical theology, which is basically a kind of combination of, at the time, very contemporary psychoanalytic, psychiatric thought and theology, without attempting to kind of dumb down either of those things. So it's an interesting combination. And he was developing this because he'd noticed role holders in the church, like vicars, members of the clergy, parishioners, were going out there, they were dealing with all sorts of kind of mental distress in their communities, bereavement, conflict, mental health issues, and also they had to look after themselves as well. And he thought they weren't getting proper training in this, they weren't getting counselling skills, so he's trying to develop something that would work in that setting. And he also, so that's kind of brings about some of the people he was working with, which were kind of vicars and members of the clergy that had their own issues. So they seem to take up kind of a lot of the people he was working with later. But it wasn't just members of the church, there was people outside of it as well over the time he was working. So in 1969 he actually wrote a paper summarising his work with a series of 68 patients over the previous 8 years, from 1961 onwards, with the aim of looking at statements about the birth experience. Gives a useful window into how he worked. So we can see that LSD was given as an adjunct to therapy with therapy. It wasn't every session. He was working between 1 and 38 sessions per patient, average 6. The working dose of LSD was 200 milligrams, so quite strong, and the length of each session was 4 to 6 hours. And he was saying that when working with people with LSD on an outpatient basis, him and his colleagues, it was usual for them to allow the patient to phone them day or night. So there was this kind of some follow-up outside of the sessions. That's quite unusual, but I think that acknowledges the depth they were working at, though he still has been criticised for not giving enough follow-up to people. And in a questionnaire he sent out to these 68 people 8 years afterwards, included this question: did you feel at the time you were again a child, a baby, being born or in the womb? And you can see 38 out of the 68 remembered this and wrote this down in the questionnaire. So if we look at the phenomenology of birth, these are Lake's organised this using statements that the patients were making during the therapy or kind of observations he would made. He wouldn't necessarily experience all of these things, but they'd probably kind of experience a few of them. Briefly going through them, we've got being it's kind of stuck or travelling along a tunnel but being stuck in it, also sense of breathlessness or suffocation. I find really interesting there's these specific sensations in different parts of the body that seemingly unexplainable but are connected to this birth experience, they thought. Sensations of heat and cold or noise, symbolic descriptions of the whole process of birth, is reactions to what's going on, a sense of duration of time and the awfulness of waiting, and final crowning and release as well. And it's important to emphasise before going forward that what we'll be talking about here is mainly people experiencing difficult births. And these are often what seem to come up in the therapeutic sessions, perhaps because they did need to be worked with, but birth isn't always that difficult, and people could also have positive experiences of being in the womb sometimes. So it's important to acknowledge, he said there's a spectrum between tough but tolerable birth or devastating in its destructiveness, as he termed it. So if we look at some of the physical sensations, there's a pressure on the back of my neck, a crushing type of pressure, all very tight. There's kind of stiffness and shuddering. He screws up his face. There seems to be extreme provocation. I don't know what it is. It's damned hard work, whatever it is. So you can see there's the sense here of the patient being kind of really involved in a process, being within something. They're not quite sure what it is, but it's really having a kind of somatic effects on their body. And they might even be asking the therapist to kind of put pressure on their head or to kind of get involved in this process that's happening. And it goes back to a previous quote I put up about the body somehow taking up positions, and there's a part of the patient that's the observer, kind of not really knowing why this is happening, but it is happening. And here's a few more. So somebody saying, I wish I knew what it was. It's just caves and water. Then it lets me go for a bit. All right. Then, oh God, it's back. What a fury. So that's the kind of some kind of confusion there. And the next one, I want to scream. My nerves were screaming, but I couldn't. And he kind of correlates this with anger. There's a kind of inexpressible anger and rage, but it just can't be expressed in that setting. And this does seem to come up as well. I wanted to die several times then. So there's a sense of being perhaps trapped, not being able to get out, and just, it's not worth the effort. I'm going to give up. And there's some reflections on birth. So this is still people within these sessions talking. And somebody here are saying the terror of these past weeks has been of being stuck in this passage alone forever. So you can see they're kind of relating kind of felt sensation that they've been having over the past few weeks in various sessions, and they're saying, hang on, is it really to do with this early experience of being stuck in a passage, not being able to get out? As also, this is interesting, I'm in revulsion at being carried along in almost an intestinal situation. So this also comes up, this sense of, it's gross, the indignity of it all. It's like I was in the womb and it was all really nice, and now this horrible situation, this seems to come up as well. And also somebody kind of reflecting, it had a lasting impact on them. The very experience of being born was enough to scare the life out of me. And so I think this is interesting too, somebody reflecting, apart from birth, is there anything at all with this kind of pain connected to it that could have happened to me. So they can't make sense of it in terms of their biographical history. There's this kind of trauma, there's these sensations, there's things happening. It seems to them that the birth perhaps is the best explanation for what they experienced, basically, to make sense of their experiences. There's a few kind of specific things he mentions in this particular paper. One of them is migraines. So it's several people kind of well within re-experiencing their birth in the LSD sessions were experiencing kind of head pain, and then one of them would say, "That's my migraine." So they kind of connected the migraine they had in adult life with this kind of early experience of pressure around the head, and perhaps the migraine did come along when stress was happening. So birth can be quite metaphorical. There's a sense of claustrophobia. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be a kind of in life things coming in, stress coming in, these kind of birth things come up. Nerve injury. So, nerve injury. There's someone who was being treated for a nerve injury separately, and they found a connection with a kind of awkward posture in being born that seemed to be connected with that. There's an Indian biologist, he recounts, who relived a birth injury where his lower jaw felt crushed up to his face. And reliving it apparently put an end to years of compulsive work procrastination on his master's degree and PhD. And finally, there's a case of the clergyman who suffered from light sensitivity and eczema. And after a difficult birth, he kind of came to the end of this process. There was the kind of light coming out of the birth experience, out of the tunnel. And he actually found he hated life and light so much that he ended up swearing at them for 3 to 4 hours, like he says, kind of cursing life, cursing light, but eventually became reconciled to them, kind of accepting that, hey, I am out here, I am in the world, in the light. And apparently he was then able to go on holiday, even sunbathe, which he wasn't able to do before, and his eczema would only appear after, under severe stress. So there's a few kind of very specific examples he recounts. But he also mentions here we go, 3 excellent things: examination fears, ceremonial and compulsive positions in bed, and resistance to leaving it for the outside world were also recorded in the sessions, people relating that to birth. And this connects with Otto Rank, who is a Freudian, at one time one of Freud's protégés, and in 1924 wrote the book, The Trauma of Birth. And that expanded on Freud's concept that not only was birth the first experienced anxiety, it was in fact the prime source material for all the neuroses and character disorders. So it's kind of the birth sets the stage for everything else, said Rank. And at its root is the act of separation. So it's the going from being in the womb, Rank would see it as kind of a blissful experience of being in the womb, suddenly coming out into this kind of perilous state of separation. What am I doing out here? And then there being a more or less kind of traumatic experience between those two things. So if we look at some results here, did it help? Well, 44 people in the response said it was cured, 20 much better, 14 a little better, 4 unchanged, and 1 worse. So pretty good, but they were kind of reporting directly to Lake, I think, so make of that what you will. This was the therapy as a whole. It wasn't just by experiencing their births, it was kind of just undergoing the therapy with LSD where birth came up. So for Lake, just a bit more about how he saw birth affecting us. He said it was powerfully determinative of the whole of a person's background, a feeling, an attitude to the universe. And this is, I think, the experience of being in the womb, he thought, as well. So you get the basic knowledge of what it's like to live outside in God's world. And there's a sense here of, if the birth experience goes okay, you come out, you're kind of held, you're kind of welcomed, and it feels all right. It's like the world's okay, it's kind of a welcoming place. You go through a difficult experience, you come out, it's a harsh environment, maybe you get put in an incubator, you don't have much human contact. The world can seem a not very pleasant place to be in, and he thinks that has kind of lasting impact on people. And he said working with birth can result in a shift in personality, a move away from passivity and acceptance of pain and suffering as our inescapable lot in the direction of reasonable self-assertion and activity. And it's important also that birth kind of connects with a feeling and attitude to transition or change. So from big life events to, as Rank says, even getting out of bed in the morning, could be this kind of moving from one state to another can often bring back birth stuff. So he was challenged writing this study by a colleague about experimenter bias. So he's like, well, you've come to believe these people are really experiencing their birth, so they kind of bring this up for you. But he said, well, maybe, but in there's 43 cases before this where I wasn't looking for this. I mean, he wasn't looking for it this time, I'm not sure, but he didn't believe it was a possible thing, but it still did come up. So he points to that as some evidence towards it. And he also points to similarities in phenomena that there seems to be some that seem to be across most people, which is around pressure in the head, things like that. But then there's these kind of unique body sensations that were unique to different individuals, and he thought that was quite compelling as well. So I know what you're thinking. It had Christ in the title. He hasn't mentioned Christ much. Well, here is Christ. I won't go into Lake's theology. It's very complicated, but it's beyond me. But what's interesting is there's this. His one aspect of it is that he thought early traumatic memories can't be brought to mind, even with the aid of LSD, unless the spirit is fortified to meet them. So it's interesting that he says this, and he separates them into two categories, those are my kind of terms for them. There's the personal, so it's really important there's a trust in the therapist who is present and available for the duration. And the relationship with the therapist is really key to therapy. But there's the transpersonal aspect, as we could say, that there needs to be a connection with something bigger to help people kind of endure what they're going through and bring something back from it. And for Lake, this was associated with the suffering of Christ, the death and resurrection being sustained by the Holy Spirit. So for him, his spirituality is not a kind of just a love and light thing. It was very much about there's a lot of room for existential angst, crisis, really going down to the depths and kind of coming back from there. Sorry, bear with me. And that seemed to be important to a number of his clients because he was working with people like vicars. And this is a village vicar saying, I know I couldn't have gone through today's experiences without you and not without Christ. And Lake documents a number of sessions with this person. And he says also his pain was so bad that had he not been a Christian, known as therapist he doesn't think he could have faced it. And that's quite interesting, there being a shared, you could say, transpersonal or spiritual framework there that kind of aided this therapy. And we've heard about other kind of shared frameworks that people are working within at this conference. And this vicar kind of managed to recover. He had encountered very deep wounding, but found divine love rushing into the space. He recovered the experience of his mother being next to his heart, physically and spiritually. And he said it was possible for Christ to come as near to me as that, indeed in me. And he also notes how his experiences have strengthened his future relationship with God. And this is a really Lake sentence, though this is the vicar that says it, because one's trust of God has its roots in the infantile trust of the mother-father. So it's really interesting how he reflects that you kind of can see the personal aspect of his spirituality and then the kind of transpersonal aspect and how those two play into each other. So a bit about, very briefly, Lake, like others in this late 60s, stopped using LSD when it became outlawed. He says he followed the Reichian hint, which is basically, that's a reference to Wilhelm Reich and his work with breath and the body. And so he found ways to kind of get into these states without using LSD. And very much like Stanislav Grof, who developed holotropic breath work to bring about similar therapeutic state. And for him, he said disadvantages of LSD was it basically was less controllable, acts beyond conscious control, sometimes bringing up material the subject isn't ready to deal with. And sometimes it can be overly symbolic and viewed with religious thinking that it's kind of, he thought, didn't make it the therapy so easy, I suppose. And for him, he went on to explore more the womb, the experience of being in the womb as becoming the most important thing. But that's enough from me about this. I mean, hopefully that was a tough but tolerable presentation. It's important to emphasize there is light at the end of the tunnel. So there's a few kind of nicer quotes to finish. So I feel such relief. I've been squoze out at last. At last I'm through. I'm quite free all round. Lovely. Thank you.